women's subordination in the socio-cultural economic sphere. There surely was an advancement for women and democracy in general. Nonetheless, the liberal feminists based their model of emancipation on the universal masculine, right-bearing, rational male individual of European Enlightenment and had its own deficiencies. This new model of the right-bearing individual was based on the notion of a citizenship that reconfigured the public-private distinction in a new way. According to this new model, there was a space of privacy for the right-bearing individual against the state, where the individual can exercise his right to property ownership, free gathering and discussion, right to practice their own faith and belief, and have some amount of control over their sexuality and reproduction. This model was copied and transferred by liberal feminists, where a private space was kept outside of the laws and husband. In fact, the family was conceived as the sacred place where the state could not enter. The problem is the family made part of the private sphere, and hence issues like domestic violence, reproduction, the choice to reproduce were all part of the private sphere where the state could not intervene. This does not mean, however, that the state was completely inactive in the lives of people. It did exercise power to control reproduction and sexuality. This was an assimilative model and failed to emancipate all women of all locations at all times. For example, within the model, wage labor was the way to emancipate women, thereby excluding those who were already part of the wage labor, such as the working class woman, and this was an assimilative model and failed to emancipate all women of all locations at all times. For example, within the model, wage labor was the way to emancipate women's aid.
I think there may be a network problem, so please bear with us. Ma'am, I think she will join very soon. Please bear with us.
Who did work and yet did not have equality. Sorry, I think the connection was a little bit lost. In addition, failed to give an emancipatory ideology for the women in the colonized space. The primary reason for this is that the model worked on the abstract notion of right-bearing universal individual without taking into account the different identities of individuals and actual situatedness. In other words, this model of liberal feminism did not have a philosophy of identity and subjectivity, or how via the actual situated experience both the subject as well as the other. Women were asked to assimilate to the male model without taking into account their difference from this abstract model. Hence, the model was based on the exclusion of many identities. In 1949, with the publication of a groundbreaking work, The Sacred Sex, Simone de Beauvoir inquired into what constitutes femininity or the feminine subjective, specifically its relation via difference from the male identity. In embarking on a historical, sociological, and anthropological inquiry, Simone de Beauvoir found that women were not merely different from the male or center, but are others. In order to understand this concept of otherness, de Beauvoir evoked the Hegelian master-slave dialectics, which gives the most significant definition of what constitutes otherness. Hegel's understanding of the dialectical movement of thought led him to take issues with the idealist notion of reason. Reason is not, as the Kantian idealists claim, a matter of fitting isolated objects into universal categories. Reason involves a self-conscious ego struggling to assimilate objects while having to fend off their otherness. Threat to its existence is a self-conscious being. Identity of subject emerges into subjectivity by having an object, its other, as Hegel showed in his master-slave dialectics. Thus, the master is the master in relation to the slave, while the slave is a slave in relation to the master. Hegel clearly showed that in order to have a subject position or subjectivity, there must be an other of the subject, an object in relation to which the subject gains her identity. According to Hegel, the master is an independent consciousness whose other is the dependent consciousness, the slave. The master needs recognition from the slave in order to be the master. The slave, the object in this relationship, is dependent on the master for his existence. His identity is the other of the master. Gradually, however, in Hegel, the relationship reverses, and the slave, by working with nature, gets his independence, although he is dependent on the master for his existence and identity. For de Beauvoir, femininity or the feminine subject is this other. Its essence is otherness per se. What does this mean? It is not an otherness of this or that culture, but otherness as such. There are othernesses of all cultures, of all times in history. For example, according to Simone de Beauvoir, the otherness of ethnic minorities or the working class evolved at a certain point in history, but the otherness of women or femininity is transhistorical. The paradoxical thing about the feminine otherness, although universal and transhistorical, is not a biological or natural otherness as Aristotle theorized, but a creation of culture. Simone de Beauvoir argues for the otherness by taking the concept from anthropologist Levi Strauss. Let us explore that idea a little bit more. Can I put on this slide because it's a little hard for me to read this paper in this the light that we have. Just give me 1 minute.
Sure, ma'am.
In his book Totem and Taboo, Freud showed that there is, despite vast differences in rules and taboos among tribes, there is one universal taboo in all tribes, the taboo of incest. In some mythical past, according to Freud, the father of the tribe kept all the women to himself. One day, the brothers rose up in revolt and killed the father and ate his flesh and drank his blood. In this last totemic meal, they made a contract that none of them will enjoy any women, they will transfer them to other tribes. This idea of transferring or exchange was used by anthropologist Marcel Mauss to show that in the absence of state, tribes maintain tribal alliance through a complex gift-giving system. The other side of gift-giving would be war. The idea of the gift and exchange were taken over by anthropologist Levi Strauss, a student of Marcel Mauss. Levi Strauss, through his research amongst the tribes, showed that there is continuous gift giving by one tribe to another. He also showed that the other side of gift giving is war, whose purpose was to create alliance. In fact, gift giving became a sacred duty amongst tribes. There were often taboos and rules against growing the food that one could get via exchange. For example, if a tribe grew sweet potatoes and exchanged it, then the other tribe would grow wheat and exchange it for sweet potatoes with the first tribe. So growing wheat was prohibited in the first tribe because they would get it via exchange, while growing sweet potato was a taboo for the second tribe because they would get it from the first tribe. There are, however, tangible commodities that do not foster permanent bondage. To create permanent bondage, there must be a universal commodity of exchange. Levi Strauss found this universal commodity of exchange in women. The purpose of exchanging women was to create tribal bondage across tribes, for it is the creation of kinship and eventually a bondage of blood by sharing children. Thus, human beings, according to Levi Strauss, stepped from subhuman to human culture when they started exchanging women and institutionalizing marriage. Exchange of women is universal, as is the taboo on incest. Women, however, were not parties to this transaction. That women were transacted for lands, gold, title, kingdoms, and other women. This institutionalized universal commodification or exchange of women is what made women the other of culture. This was the idea that Simone de Beauvoir took to say that women or femininity must be defined as the supreme other of all cultures. So femininity is not a subject of knowledge or the self, but an other, something that has no proper place in creating history. While liberal feminism modeled femininity on the subjectivity of the right-bearing individual of the European Enlightenment, de Beauvoir gave a notion of feminine subject that is the other and hence not properly a subject or self. So femininity became a subject only via difference or othering. What is the root cause of this othering of the feminine subject? When asked, Levi Strauss said that because women are commodities of exchange to create kinship. When further asked if groups of women could have transacted men, Levi Strauss said yes, but also said that in reality it never happened. When prodded further, Levi Strauss said that because there was always a scarcity of this commodity, women in nature due to, quote, the deep polygamous nature of men. So ultimately, Levi Strauss, despite his cultural explanation, fell back into biology. In the first chapter of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir also said that women have not been free due to men's innate biological sexual needs and their desire for offspring. So we see that both of them, they go back to biologism and explains the otherness, which avoids the entire notion of identity and subjectivity of the other, for everything is reduced to biology. It took Freud and the psychoanalytic movement to explain in depth what otherness meant for subjectivity. Although Freud was not a biological determinist, nonetheless he gave a notion of identity that is important for us to understand what constitutes an identity in difference through a theory of lacking, or having a lack. So let us next try to understand the psychoanalytic take on femininity, otherness, and lacking, which I'm going to call the open wound. The answer given in psychoanalysis by using the theory of biological determinism. Freud was a biological determinist who explained human identity in terms of biology and somewhat tried to demystify the concept of human psyche. Freud theorized that the central principle that dominates human development is the libido or pleasure principle. The libido has to be understood as a life force that moves through different body parts and causes the growth and formation of the human identity and a sense of self. For Freud, human identity develops as a result of castration complex, which he equated with the death instinct in his essay Inhibition, Symptom, and Anxiety. In other words, under this threat of annihilation of the life force of castration complex, the human child develops an ego. According to Freud, we are not born with the ego. Our sense of having a self evolves during infancy and early childhood as the life force and libido travels through the oral, anal, and genital stages. In the oral stage and the anal stage, when the libido is concentrated on the mouth, and in the anal stage on the anus. Pleasure is derived by passing of the species. Freud also called this the anal sadistic stage. In these two stages, there is no differentiation or object in the Freudian term. The ego libido and the subject object libido do not exist. Again, there is no consolidated sense of ego or self because without the other, there cannot be an I. It is a time of primary narcissism where there is an absolute unity of the mother and the child. It is a return to this state Freud claims that we are striving for in our pursuit of happiness. Returning to his treatment of idealization, Freud suggests that since this idea, which is unattainable, the return to the primary narcissism, the oneness with mother, is what we are looking for in our social and emotional sexual lives, every object of our desire is idealized. The idea of the other or the object libido developed at the genital stage where the child enters the auricular complex. At this stage, there is a sense of the other. Or phallic mother, a mother in fantasy, the all-powerful mother who gives life and nourishment and who was the first object of love for the child. Next, the child develops a complex known as the castration complex, that is the loss of pleasure or life force. At this stage, separate identities are developed and consolidated. A little boy's castration complex gives him the message instinctually that if he does not give up his desire for the phallic mother and masturbation, his most important organ, the phallus, will be cut off. So he preserves himself. The little boy gives up his first object of love, the phallic mother, who is not really the mother but the fantasy mother, and stops his masturbation or autoeroticism. As no desire gets lost, the original desire for the phallic mother goes into the unconscious. And since the unconscious of the other is born, the conscious or the I or the self, according to Freud, is born for the little boy. The path to feminine identity is more complex according to Freud. At the beginning of life, during the oral and anal stages, all human beings are bisexual. The little girl is active and masturbates with her clitoris, because for Freud there is only one sex, the male and then the not male, and the clitoris is a cut of phallus. As she enters the genital phase, the girl realizes that she's already castrated and a little of the phallus, the clitoris, is left. The cause of this undergrowth within Freudian framework is evolutionary and biological problem. The girl undergoes a psychical castration complex, a trauma, and she realizes that the phallic mother does not have the phallus either to give to her, and that the mother, like her, is also castrated. This makes her turn her against the mother and all those who have bodies like her. She starts to hate her own body and all those who are castrated like her. Moreover, she develops an ambivalent attitude towards the mother. So, according to Freud, what is a possibility for the boy, castration, is an accomplished fact for the little girl. She realizes that she does not have the organ of pleasure or the life force. This hurts the little girl's primary narcissism and she undergoes a trauma. She goes to father to get the phallus, who does not give it either. To get the phallus in her body, she tries to please father and takes his beatings and rape in order to get the desired organ in her body. When she does not get the organ, she settles for her biological destiny. This involves her transforming her original desire for a phallus to a desire for a baby from father or father substitute, the transference of the erotic zone from the clitoris to the vagina, and the substituting the clitoral activity to the vaginal vicinity. The vagina, in a Freudian term, is a non organ, a bloody hole, an open wound that never gets closed and often becomes infected and secretes pus. We all return to this concept. We will return to this concept of the loss of the primary narcissism and the open wound shortly. The little girl's original desire, the desire for the phallus, goes into the unconscious as her feminine identity is formed. The unconscious desire of the male is the phallic mother. The conscious one is the identification of the father and the consolidated male identity. As his phallus is retained, he may now get back the primary narcissism and unity with mother in coitus with identities who lack the phallus, that is a woman. The self or subjectivity is both only when there is the other, the unconscious is. So the little girl will not get, she realizes she'll never go back to her primary narcissism because the organ she needs to go back to the mother is not there anymore. The boy retains the organ so that he can go back to the womb of the mother, or those who do not have phallus, mother substitute, because he has the organ. So that's the Freudian explanation of the primary narcissism, the open wound. Or the discovery of the open womb. That is the womb for the woman. She cannot go back to mother because she does not have the organ to go back. With the little girl, on the other hand, the original desire of the desire for the phallus goes to the unconscious. That the desire for the phallus is a feminine desire par excellence. The little girl suffers a double loss: the loss of her primary object of desire, the phallus, and her primary narcissism object of love, the phallic mother, or the primary unity before the subject object dichotomy was formed. In Freud and psychoanalysis, normal femininity is thus formed over the death of primordial unity with mother. When the little girl discovers her castrated state, she turns against and hates her mother. She actually hates her mother and all women for their loss, which she too have suffered. Eventually, she accepts her biological destiny, converts her desire for the baby, for desire for the original desire for the phallus to a desire for baby from father or father substitute, transforms her erotic zone from the clitoris to the vagina. If she does not settle for her biological destiny, according to Freud, she develops to abnormal identities. A, frigidity. She says to herself, since I cannot have as much pleasure as my brother, I won't have any pleasure at all. B, homosexuality, where she thinks that father has given her the phallus, and with that phallus, there is a possibility of going back to the primary narcissistic coitus with mother. On this model, the feminine subjectivity is the unfulfilled desire for the phallus, which is covered up by the fulfilled desire for the child. According to Freud, the original desire for the phallus never goes away, and woman never recovers from the trauma of loss of the phallus. This is transformed into other substitutes like baby and goes into the memory trace in the unconscious. It is a loss or lack that causes the feminine psyche to be envious, jealous, quarrelsome. In addition, women, according to Freud, has little sense of justice and has weak social interest and has not contributed anything to civilization. The only thing which women are good at is plaiting and weaving, which is a metaphor for their pubic hair that covers her same shame for her wound or her loss. Let us now summarize what we have said about feminine subjectivity. First, Aristotle depicted feminine subjectivity as a lower level of rationality. Second, liberal feminism modeled the feminine identity on the right bearing individual male. Then, as the other of culture and negation, Simone de Beauvoir and some anthropologists depicted the feminine subjectivity as a lack that, although cultural, fell into biologism. None of these talked about identity indifference in lacking of the feminine evolved uh, in psychoanalysis. With Freud, we saw that normal feminine subjectivity is constructed along the lines of pathological identity, whose very identity or subjectivity is founded on a loss and a trauma. The loss of the primary narcissism, the absolute unity with the other, which because of their lacking the facts. Due to this lack, the feminine subjecthood cannot have become a full but only a part subject. As Melanie Klein said, according to Klein, the first other happens much before the genital stage of the libido travels. Unlike Freud, Freud says the concept of the other develops during the genital stage, but Klein said no, it develops from the oral stage. But the other is only a part object. How the child recognizes the breast as the other. The child develops envy and frustration with this part object and conceives it along the lines of good breast and bad breast, according to Klein. The recognition of this infantile object or body parts remains for us throughout our lives and on the basis of our seeing the other. Sarah J. Jervis, Terry Kay, etc. says, quote, seeing woman's body as part object recognition bias. Objectification theory suggests that the bodies of women are sometimes reduced to the sexual body parts. I think it's always reduced to the sexual body parts, as well as extensive literature in cognitive psychology. Yes, please. Surely. Cognitive underlies object recognition. Integrating this literature, we understand the sexual part recognition bias hypothesis that women versus men bodies will be reduced to their sexual body parts. Thus, feminine subjectivity is only a part subject and fails to become a whole subject, which is actually, there is a museum in Europe which displays vaginas and breasts, part object. And next, we'll analyze how subsequent theories have interpreted femininity as this double loss, the womb. Of the first loss, the fallacy is identified as a lack of a special organ of pleasure. This loss is repressed and covered by the baby from the desire for a baby from father or father substitute. The second loss is the loss of the primary narcissism. I happen to think that's the first loss, the unity with the mother. The first loss or lack of an organ and the castration complex is the bedrock of gender identity and questioned by subsequent therapists. How can, for example, in 1920s, there was a debate about feminine subjectivity in psychoanalytic theory. The question was, how men go through castration complex. They are scared that they will lose their most important organ. But how can little girls be scared? Because we cannot be scared of something we do not have. I am only scared of losing my, say, $1,000 in the bank. If I do have $1,000, if I don't have $1,000, I have $50 in the bank. I'm not scared of losing. So that was their question. How can you put that male identity into the feminine identity? If the little girl did not have an organ, so how can she be scared of losing the organ? What is her frustration? In other words, the concept of lack is vague and not clear. So instead of the negative connotation the lack carries, analysts like Bonaparte, they're even more misogynist, I think, these female analysts than Freud. Analysts like Bonaparte and the feminine subjectivity said that the feminine subjectivity is not about a lack, it's about a different kind of libido. What is that libido? It is something that Freud did not understand. Freud said that there is only one libido, the pleasure libido. Now, his student Mary Bonaparte, also an analyst, saying
Audience, please bear with us. Maybe ma'am, you have some network problem.
sorry, the internet went and came back. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
So Mary Bonaparte says femininity is not a lack; it's actually a different kind of libido. And guess what she said? She says Freud was biased with his male ego that the only kind of femininity libido is the masculine libido of pleasure. Now Bonaparte, who is an advocate of women, said no, femininity is a different libido called masochism. So what creates the feminine subjectivity is not the lack of the desire to cover the lack, but the masochistic experience of pain in coitus, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation. The more masochism she adopts in her body, time is circular. How so? Because for them, woman's libido is not the pleasure principle of Freud. It's a different kind of libido called the masochistic libido. So what happens? She desires the phallus. She gets it in her body through coitus, through intercourse. Then she loses it when the intercourse is over. So she gains it and loses it. Then she gets the phallus in her body when she's pregnant. And then when the child is born, she loses it. Then she gets the phallus back in her body, or it becomes part of her when she's lactating. Then she loses it when the child is weaned. Then she gets it back again in coitus. And then she loses it when the intercourse is over. Then she gets it back in pregnancy, loses it when in childbirth, gets it back in lactation, loses it in weaning. So her entire cycle of pregnancy, coitus, childbirth, lactation is driven by what these analysts, the women analysts, call masochistic libido. So imagine how misogynist these people were. So her entire libido is really all about this masochistic libido cycling. That's why for these analysts, women's time is not linear. That's a patriarchal time. Women's time is actually circular. Alright, she gives up her initial clitoral activity and gains a new one, the pleasure via the pain of coitus, pregnancy, lactation. With the death of her original desire, that is her identity as a mother happens. Now, here is very subtle, and I'm going to talk about this more. It's only when her clitoral activity, her active feminine self is dead, and she becomes a mother, that she becomes truly feminine, because then the special libido called the feminine masochistic libido comes inside her body and she becomes a real woman. Thus, feminine subjectivity is not a soul embodied identity, but relational and embodied mother. So, by giving her a separate identity, masochism, they actually really pushed her further, because this whole idea of masochism, women enjoy pain, was used in the pattern. The reason why she's not leaving a relationship is she enjoys getting beaten up and so on. Next comes John, trained under Freud. Rivera gives us a new definition of feminine subjectivity using Freud's theory of the lack. According to Rivera, femininity is not the lack, but the pretense of a lack in order to get by in society. Rivera takes a cue from Ernest Jones, who translated most of Freud's books from German into English. We saw earlier that within the Freudian schema, femininity is a lack of the phallus, and the desire for the phallus is a feminine desire for excellence. For we can only desire that which we lack. A normal feminine is one who suppresses the original desire for phallus and substitutes for a desire for baby from father or other such. And if she fails, she becomes either frigid or homosexual. That's Freud. Now, Ernest Jones, who translated Freud, said there are two types of homosexual women: one who retains the subject libido and one who becomes the object libido. One who retains the subject libido, for them, they still have father as an object. They desire father as the other. They still are heterosexual in some sense, because they still desire father, but they cannot stop this unfairness, injustice, his all kinds of problems with father, but they still desire father as the other. The other homosexual, according to Ernest Jones, this is not Freud, this is Ernest Jones, is the object libido. In that, they pretend or they think that father has given me the phallus, so I don't need to desire father. He's not the other, he's me. He's identified with me. Now they enjoy femininity not in the other but in the self, like father would be. Because psychoanalysis is all about this dualism, subject and object. So there are two types of homosexual according to Ernest Jones. Now Joan Rivera takes this up and she says femininity is not the lack of a phallus but the pretense of a lack. So, so what? How does she say that? Rivera theorizes that femininity is not a lack but the pretense of a lack. There are women nowadays who are very good public speakers and are good at traditional men's job, the intellectual skills. They have taken up father's speech or logos, which is traditionally male's job, and are afraid of father's revenge. That father would take revenge because they have dethroned father. They are afraid that they have castrated father and hiding his phallus because logos or speech belongs to father. To avoid father's revenge, they pretend that they lack the phallus. They hide the phallus, and what they do is they perform femininity. They behave as if they're stupid. They flirt with father. They perform coquetry. They go on saying, "I don't know how to repair a car. I don't know how to do math well, and I'm so stupid." So to boost his ego. So actually, they don't lack a phallus, but they pretend. They perform it. So Joan Rivera brings femininity, the subjectivity of femininity to another level, said that femininity is actually the pretense of a lack. So we talked about the different interpretation of the lack. The first loss, the second loss, the loss of the primary narcissism, which is forever for lacking a phallus. Woman cannot go back to the absolute unity with mother. The loss of this primary unity is what constitutes femininity. It's a reminder she does not have the phallus and cannot possess mother as the other. Nor can she go back to the absolute unity. For she adopted femininity in her body and thus cannot be in unity with femininity in the other, because it's either me or the other. The loss is what leads to a new attribute for femininity. She's melancholy. For Lucy Rigre, the feminine subjectivity is not a lack or a desire for the phallus, but a subject whose essence is melancholy, whose loss of primary narcissism is complete. For she can never go back to the primary unity with mother. Thus, it is an open wound. In his essay Mourning and Melancholia, Freud analyzes melancholia by comparing and contrasting it with mourning. The two are similar, have similar symptoms, concludes Freud. But melancholy, according to Freud, is a pathology, while mourning is a temporary condition. According to Freud, mourning affects the psyche as a result of the loss of an object of love due to death. In the melancholy, on the other hand, the object of love is not be dead, but we have withdrawn the love or have slightly jilted and abandoned it. Both melancholy and mourning show that the following symptoms: painful dejection, loss of interest in love and life, and inhibition of all kinds of actions. Moreover, in mourning, the mourner exactly knows what caused the pain and can point to the lost object. In melancholia, one knows what caused it, but not how it was caused. Because something unknown in melancholia that the melancholic cannot name or pinpoint her finger at, which is the root of her psychic discomfort. One further interesting thing in melancholy, according to Freud, is that the melancholic has an ambivalent attitude towards the lost object, for there is both love and hate. The melancholic has given up the object of love, but not the love itself. Via the observation of cases in the clinical setting, Freud concludes that a mourner can be brought back to a happy and normal state via intense therapy, whereas the client and the therapist go through arduous tasks of recalling memories involving the lost object. Thus, slowly through his working through and with time, the mourner sees the reality and comes to terms with the loss, and his ego is re-established. In melancholia, the task of reinstating the normal psyche is much more difficult, for it is not a condition but a complex. The most intriguing thing about melancholia is that the melancholic critiques himself or herself and declares herself as worthless and of little value. The melancholic also has a desire to be punished for the loss. All the criticism and judgments have moral tones. The melancholic does not critique his own social status or the lack of his material wealth. although he's worried about his scarcity, but declaring himself to be worthless, having no value, the melancholic does not treat the others around him with humility or respect. Actually, because the melancholic is aggressive, he's what we call passive aggressive. In this respect, the melancholic flaunts her condition of being slighted and relishes the injustice. And the way, according to Lucy Gay, the way Freud describes feminine subjectivity is like the melancholy. She relishes her oppressed position. She flaunts it. She shows it off. In so, the melancholic flaunts her condition of being slighted and relishes all the injustice done to her. In this sense, the condition of melancholic is similar to that of a hypochondriac who enjoys his symptom and relishes his illness. According to Freud, what happens is a split in thus Freud's melancholic is actually critiquing the lost object. In addition, by relishing her illness, she is creating a sense of guilt in the lost object. Part of the ego is identified and part carried back to sadism. When the melancholic tries to commit suicide, it is when he turns part of himself to the ego and wants to kill that part. According to Freud, complex of melancholia draws all libido and energy, impoverishes the ego, and in this sense is like an open wound where all the energy or libido of the melancholic is concentrated and her ego is impoverished. As her narcissism is hurt, the ego wants to identify the object by devouring it. So many melancholics, there is an inhibition against taking food. It regresses back to the oral stage, something that Freud says is derived from his clinical observation. Sometimes the melancholic identifies with the object, loss in symptoms in the form of hysteria. We saw above that the melancholic cannot point his finger at what is causing the anxiety, the pain, the loss of interest in love and life. The source is not in the conscious mind. For Freud, the source is in the unconscious mind for the lost object. According to Lucy Gay, within the Freudian framework and in general in the medical model of human development, feminine identity is melancholic and hence pathological. Now we come worse. From Aristotle confused rationality to lack to pathological. Femininity is pathological, hysteric pathological. Freud said that after the discovery of her already frustrated state, the little girl's primary narcissism is severely hurt and she's traumatized. She realizes that the clitoris is not the organ of pleasure and the source of energy, life-giving energy. This leads to her inhibition of sexual activity and passivity, a symptom similar to the inhibitions of the melancholic. Like the melancholic, she loses interest in other things. For her, has lesser social interest and outer world. Her vagina is an open wound which gathers all the energy. Her ego is impoverished and she suffers from low self-esteem, which causes her to be envious and jealous. Igare says that the most important trauma in the life of the little girl is when she adopts an identity as a feminine because she has to give up her primary object of love, the mother, and all women. See, for Lucy Igare, this is the interpretation. The primary narcissism and the unity of the mother and the child cannot be represented in the phallocentric language, for it is something beyond language. It is a loss that is unneighborable, like the melancholic cannot give an actual reason for his melancholy. The little girl does not possess a phallus and can never go back to the primary narcissistic unity with mother in coitus. For her, mother does not possess the phallus and hence cannot give her the phallus. A part of the little girl's ego identified with the lost mother, the primary object of love, and the other part is a critique for that part. So her attitude toward the lost mother is one of ambivalence. This feature of femininity is that of melancholia. The mourner knows what he has lost, but the melancholy does not. Similarly, feminine identity develops via the loss of the primary narcissism and the bonding with the mother. It is also a loss that cannot be represented in phallocentric language, and hence it is a loss that cannot be known. Femininity thus is melancholia par excellence. It remains in the unconscious and shapes the feminine identity. Only with the death of a woman, mother, can there be the birth of a child with a feminine identity. And I'm going to apply this to Ashapurna Devi's trilogy. That cannot be represented within the phallocentric language is passed down intergenerationally. When she discovers a lack and open wound of the vagina, all her energy is concentrated on the ovary. She suffers from low self-esteem. Like the melancholic, feminine identifies with the bodily infirmity, ugliness, and social inferiority. Like the melancholic, she actually relishes her slight shame, and her inferior position. But in reality, that part of the ego that identifies with the mother is critiqued and castigated by the other part, her ego, just as the melancholic does. The um, libido is withdrawn to the ego, and the ego incorporates this object and regresses back to the oral stage. The melancholic refuses nourishment. Thus, fasting and anorexia, feminine acts. We now can substitute what Joan Rivera says, that the loss is not a real loss, but the performance of a loss to avoid father's revenge. Within the symbolic order, she cannot represent the performance of the loss of her bonding with mother and other women. For her, death of the mother woman is her identity as the woman feminine or normal woman. She cannot mourn this loss for the mother, for she has no language, and hence the loss becomes pathological, and so is her identity as a melancholy. She relishes her lack, her illness, her pathology. All she has left is hysteria, without which there is the death of her feminine identity. Femininity is thus a state between life and death, waking and dreaming, ambiguous, unclear, ambivalent, non consolidated, and hysteric. We saw above that feminine subjectivity has gone from hysteric to pathological, ultimately to the macabre and ordered as an abject, and that is neither the subject nor the object of knowledge, but something beyond both, one which is primordial and cannot be expressed in language. The self always develops in relation to the other. According to Julia Kristeva, an abject is a human reaction or a vomit. This is the open book to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the distinction between the subject and object. The primary example is a corpse. We remind ourselves of mortality. Things like open wound, shit, sweat can evoke such emotions. It is something that is placed before the symbolic order and is an absurdity. As Kristeva said, abjection preserves what exists in the anarchism of pre-abjectal relationship in the immemorial violence with which the body becomes separated from another body in order to be, because we have to separate from mother. The abject is the primordial repression. The abject is of which the body becomes separated from another body. The abject primordial repression, one that precedes the establishment of the subject's relation to its object of desire and representation, even before the establishment of the opposition between consciousness and unconsciousness. Kristeva instead said, to the moment of our psychosocial development, when we establish a border between human and animal, between culture and that which precedes it. On the level of anarchic memory, Kristeva refers to the primitive effort to separate ourselves from animals by way of abjection. Primitive societies have marred out the precise area of their culture in order to remove it from the threatening word of animal and animalism, which were unimaginative as representation of sex and murder. On the level of individual psychosocial development, the abstract marker, the moment we separate ourselves from the mother, we begin to recognize a boundary between me and the other. Other mother. The abject is the precondition of narcissism, which is to say a precondition for the narcissism of the mirror stage, which occurs after we establish the primal distinction. The abject thus represents the threat that meaning is breaking down. So women break down meaning because it's hysteria. Abject has to do with what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, position, rules, and can also include crimes and fragility of law. It is the eruption of the real and the rejection of the less insistent materiality. Our reaction to such abject material recharges, comprehends the meaning of death and its trauma. A wound with the blood and puts on the sickly and smell of sweat of decay does not signify death. It is the present of signified death that we are talking about. In our search for feminine identity, we went from hysteric to masochistic to melancholy and then macabre as the different attributes of feminine subjectivity. Most of those centered around the loss or lack of object. In the 1950s, French analyst Jacques Lacan showed that Freud's theory is not about sexuality but about subjectivity. All subjects develop in a loss. In his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud moved away from his initial pleasure principle to a different theory, and he showed how his little grandchild would play the Forta game where he would lose a toy, specifically inflict the pain of loss of his mother, and then when the toy came back, he rolled the toy under the bed and said, "Die." In German, it's there, and fought if German is there and it's coming back, which is a trauma to stand the separation from mother. And subjectivities are ultimately, and what Lacan showed that with the child and his mirror self, he's trying to appear himself and disappear himself from the mirror. The whole identity acts. So everyone, because we are all compartmentalized, all identities are fractured. But the difference between masculine and feminine identity, according to Lacan, is that the masculinity projects his lack on the femininity. You don't have it, therefore I have the whole idea. Know the man. But the way they play the game is yes, yes, you have it, but she knows neither of them have the perfect identity, perfect subject. But she pretends in patriarchal society, she pretends you have it, I lack it to keep status quo. But he does not know that he's lacking. He's the master self. He says, you lack, therefore someone must have it, I have. But ultimately, all subjectivities are illusions. In the short essay Purloined Letter, Edgar Allan Poe talks about the Queen's lover arriving in court with a letter. And the Queen sees it and becomes very upset. And then the minister sees it and he exchanges it with a fake one. Then another minister sees it and exchanges that fake letter with a second fake letter. So in this whole exchange, the difference between the fake and the real letter gets jeopardized. So no one knows which is the fake and which is the real. Like this, in the same way, masculinity and femininity are all illusions. No one knows what is performativity and what is real. If I understand correctly, Yogacara Buddhism, the stored consciousness is an illusion, alaya vijnana, the subliminal repository of psychological propensities and mental consciousness, manovidyana, mental state, which ultimately appears as the consciousness in Buddhism. It is very true. Consciousness is one, and consciousness is like the lamp. To the case of Ashapurna Devi's trilogy, Prokum Pratishruti, Subornalata, and Gopalpata. The mother-daughter relationship in the first two of the trilogy, the relationship between Shrutabati and Subornalata. Shrutabati was not dead, but she lost her daughter Subornalata. For Subornalata to be born as a woman, for her femininity of as resistance, she had to lose the mother. Using psychoanalytic framework, one can say that Shrutabati is the unconscious. It is a lost desire, and the desire that makes some people unhappy. That is why Shubhanlata's journey was based on the loss of the mother, as the loss of the self is the birth of the human species. Society is based on the loss of the primary narcissism, the mother. Since this loss cannot be represented symbolically, it cannot be known. It is ingrained and melancholy of human civilization, of its aggression, war, envy, and pain. In order for a resistant self to be created, the primary narcissism, the mother, had to be lost. So within this framework, both the self and femininity cannot exist at the same time. Femininity has to be lost in order for the self to attain its identity. Since this loss cannot be named, it cannot be known. Shubhanulata was too busy fighting against the social familial injustice to mourn for the loss of her primary narcissism, her mother. When her resistance, phallocentric ego dissolved during sleep, when she was sick, her mother appeared to her sometimes. In this expression of collective fantasy of our primary narcissism, open wound never heals. As Sartre said, every moment of existence, nothing to guide us. It is a moment of dread and anguish. Nonetheless, each moment of action is also a species act. Similarly, each act of mourning is a species mourning. One mourns for the loss of our primary narcissism. Hence, healing, like the feminist method of consciousness raising, is always collective healing. When one is wounded, we are all wounded. When one heals, the healing process begins. The journey of the hysteric subject is not linear but circular. Kristeva said that woman's time is not linear. Deutsch also showed that masochistic libido is not in society. There was an open wound of injustice. Antigone, by her very absurd hysteric being, stood against the system of power. Her being a product of incest is itself a transgression and hence an absurdity. The calm, rational order of the Athenian system was shaken when Aristotle was falsely accused of subverting the Athenian society. He adopted the hysteric and the melancholic subjectivity and questioned the Athenian hospitality. Let us now see how contemporary feminist movement occupy the subject position of our time. The open wounds in our time times. It is symptoms in poverty, social exclusion, class inequality, ethnic and religious violence, gender oppression with technology. Now, the hysteric, melancholic, macabre subject returns with a new face of technology and wishes to solve our problems by using technology. According to feminists like Shulamit Firestone, the root of class, race, gender oppression is the biological family, and women's primary oppression is her role in reproduction. Since the open wound in our times reveals itself in the form of scarcity and poverty, the hysteric subject adopts the role of destroying the biological family and bringing in artificial reproduction. Firestone envisioned a society where there is no biological family, no private property, no class or gender. All resources are evenly distributed because there is no gender, because there is no biological reproduction. A second type of hysteric subjectivity demands the introduction of cyborgs by Donna Haraway. Feminist theorists like Haraway conceive of a society where their gender binaries are replaced by cyborgs who are half human, half machines. Modern life is filled with cyborg as we experience social reality via machines like we are doing right now. This is, it's not natural. The cyborg is a mixture of a machine and organism and does away with the castration complex or masochism or even the division of labor according to Marxist feminists. The division between the home and market are private and public and market over land. The wealthy enter the market via consumer, the poor through informal sector. According to Firestone and Donna Haraway, if we involve artificial birth and technology and cyber, it will be done. I don't support that because there are several reasons. In the modern Western society, women and slaves no longer lack choices. A lot of social opportunities are open up. Nonetheless, a new way of creating femininity has evolved in the Western world. For example, in the US, welfare system considers masculinity as possessive individualism, exchanger in the labor market, citizens depending on public charity, getting welfare, non-deserving, unemployed, non-working. Similarly, all subalterns like undocumented people, refugee, low-wage labor are considered pathologies. These identities have alienated life like Marx saw in the 18th century, 19th century workers in England. And like Antigone, who was excluded from the police for her birth, violated the norms of Greek society. Similarly, identities such as refugees, undocumented people, working class, war veterans, all happen via process of loss and social exclusion because they can never go back to the original land of desire. On the body of lost mother, we can build civilization by transforming the natural into cultural. The natural earth has to be lost for our survival, and gives which the natural earth gives us our primary nourishment. Without the loss of this primary attachment, we cannot build our civilization. The solution is not top-down therapy that constructs this ideology, identities and pathological, nor is the solution to change our evolutionary history via technology, which is what Shulamit Firestone and Donna Haraway said. We cannot go back to our primary narcissism and our absolute unity with the mother, but we can build communities across culture and participate in the process of healing. Haraway thinks that building these communities are fictional and cannot happen. I, on the other hand, believe that each community that survived loss and traumatized can regain their sense of self via collective healing and sharing. Human civilization cannot go back to primary narcissism, but we can fantasize it and at least mimic or via collective healing. The pandemic has led to a new culture of work from home, and the ideological dimension of the separation of home and work has been exposed. Capitalism only values work that is exchange value, while slave labor, one was confined to the private. Capitalism incorporates the slave and women and other identities. In advanced capitalism, this inclusion is a brutal process. First, these identities are pathologized, and then they're offered therapies that are top down and not bottom up. A safe space is where one could actually talk about the experience without being ridiculed or disbelieved. A safe space is an environment in which everyone feels comfortable expressing themselves and participating fully without fear of attack, ridicule, or denial of experience. To create this, one has to develop trust and safety. Together with this, we add the more radical theory of brave space. Bravery is needed because learning necessarily involves not merely taking risk, but the pain of giving up a former condition in favor of a new way of seeing things. Feminist raising includes all of this. First, women speak in safe spaces, and then they build collective trust. They speak in brave places. when marginalized groups slowly come face to face with the marginalization, what is needed is collective healing, the true inclusion that does not mimic the older system of othering. Collective healing is probably starting in the margins, and here we see the first glimmer of a truly inclusive policy. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an excellent and thought-provoking of lack and how it is represented in the psychoanalysis, feminist psychoanalysis. Can you please foreground your views on Helen Sixu's ideas about this lack? Thank you, ma'am.
And she, sorry, that's excellent. She's one of my favorite authors. She actually transforms the lack into the hysteric and the absurd. The, her Medusa, right? The Medusa laughs at the face. She takes the mirroring of Laka and she converts the mirror. So when the mirror is now reflecting, the the reflection is now turned back on. What if I'm facing someone and that person's what I'm seeing is a mirror that's the others. Now it's reverse. It's gone back, and the she's actually isn't she giving a subjectivity that's I won't call it absurd, but that's kind of threatening. Her laugh of Medusa reminds me of the Kali, the Kali, the Chinnomastaka, in some ways because it's also the macabre and it's also dangerous because I can laugh at your face and I am not turned. My turning you into a stone, I actually dare to crush down the phallocentric. But I'm turning to. She takes the text and she completely turns it around. So yes, she does give an identity. The lack in her becomes subjectivity, almost the subjectivity of it. Chinnamasta is very interesting. Isn't she drinking her blood? The whole tantric kriya. So that's a macabre. That's the Julia Kristeva and Sixto, they explore that quite a bit. So that's a part subject, lack of subject that turns into the horror. See, death, we are all very scared of death
Yes.
because we don't understand its meaning. That's the whole point. That is why we are scared of, at least in Western philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, it's different. We don't understand.
Definitely, ma'am. So I would ask our respected audience and other students to please come forward with your questions. Our faculty member, Dr. Dishari Roy, she has a question. So her question,
Yeah.
let me
Let,
read
let
it
me,
out.
yeah.
Do you
Open
think?
the chat.
Yes,
Go ahead.
yes. It is in the
Let me
chat.
open the chat. Yeah, it's in the chat. Professor Dishari Roy says, do you think Simone de Beauvoir's declared he's the subject, he's the average, he's the other, particular important self-hood for him? She was still a liberal feminist, right? For her, this all self as illusion, which is the postmodern position, she was still not there. Certainly, she claimed some selfhood for the feminine, where she, although she breaks away from the Wollstonecraft's very strict liberalism of mimicking the male model of the 19th century, 18th century Enlightenment, right? She gives the importance of selfhood for the feminine. We are still in liberal feminism because we are still in that assimilating model of the 19th century. Certainly.
Thank you, ma'am, for the explanation. Ma'am, I have an observation come question. Okay, so I'm sharing that. First of all, when we talk about, you talked about several things which are also quite relevant to what we have in our course. So I think that the students must have enjoyed that. And in relation to this, I would like to say that when we talk about the celebration of the penis, like when men have that, and they celebrate it in terms of either by gratifying their libido or the lustfulness. In that context, when we talk about Eve Enslayer's vagina monologue, ma'am, what is your stance on it? I mean, how will you interpret vagina monologues in the context of femininity as an open wound, or if we want to extend the discussion further, how to heal that wound? So, is Eve Enslayer's vagina monologue helping us or proceeding towards a much more concrete, kind of celebration in any of the ways? I was just wondering. I just wanted to know that.
Actually, the whole question of dialogue monologue probably doesn't even apply to the beginning way that femininity is a loss that has no phallocentric language. Nonetheless, Christopher said this that there are other languages. It need not be that structured semantic language. There are other languages. That's Freud said that about the dream. Look at the structure of the dream. There is the explicit content, and then there is the latent. Now, if we take the vagina monologue, like I said, that the way I interpret the trilogy of Ashapurna Devi, Shoktabhakti, see, she never saw her mother after she got married at night, which for us is child abuse and so on, but that's different. We live in a different time. Now, but the author did bring back the mother when I think she fell sick as a little girl, and of course the mourning is very deep. It's almost melancholia, and in the dream. So what happens in the dream is some of these latent content surfaces. So we can use the vagina monologue as a dream content of culture. The surface content, and then the when we are hearing people speak, we have superficial hearing, like we are hearing what they're saying, but there is a deeper inner content. Slowly, when I go through counseling classes and so forth, slowly you will know the story behind all of this. I was thinking, why did this guy, who was very absurd, an 18-year-old guy, buy a gun, go and kill a bunch of children in a school? That's the story. But what's the basic story? What's the implication? And we go deeper and deeper and layers. And so we can take vagina monologue as the answer. That's why I said that Shoktabhakti is actually the unconscious mind. That's why there is no way the author could have the two meet. Because if they two meet, then Shubhanalata wouldn't be the fighter that she is. Remember, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the little baby, little Hans, he's inventing two games. One is he's putting himself up and looking at himself in the mirror, then he's sitting down and he's so he's inflicting that pain because he was very attached to mom. He won't stay in the room. He's crying for mom all the time. And mom is busy with his work. So he's trying to inflict the trauma on him of the loss to survive without mom. Our self, when does a self happen? It's always in a loss, right? And we can take vagina monologue in that way. It's an attempt at reaching in that non-phallocentric loss. It's beyond the dream consciousness. It's very interesting because dreams are absurd, right? We see all kinds of stuff in dreams, like mythology. So yes, I would take vagina monologue as a symptom.
Women, or the situation in which, especially in a third world country like India, is going through. So it's more needed to open their wounds, which women do not. I mean, hardly they come out with their wounds because mostly we have been taught from our early childhood to conceal, to hide our wounds. Okay, so whether in the form of the narrative or in the form of in terms of activism, it's really very essential, especially in a country like where women are full of silences. So it can be one of the ways of a way out to think of their wounds, how to open their wounds, isn't it, ma'am?
Absolutely. First of all, opening someone's wound is very difficult, right? You adopt that position. It happens, as I said, in dream and when our egos kind of opening. And actually, Freud goes one step further. He says femininity, in general, in psychoanalysis, is like that, monopathic. And Deutsch will also say they relish their wounds. Didn't he say that? Actually, they love their melancholy, the melancholic.
Yes.
Gray said that the femininity is melancholy. Why? Because the melancholic actually enjoys her position of her injustice and so on. They actually see when you have no subjectivity. Think of someone in prison. They have no subjectivity, nothing. The only way you can acquire subjectivity is when you start relishing your own condition. And that's very interesting. When they start enjoying their wound, it's only through a trauma, and it's very intergenerational. These traumas, yeah.
Ma'am, we really enjoy this proverb, Mede pran koi macher pran. So we really enjoy this kind of proverb, yes. So we have the power to
yes. So you get, that's the whole
Absolutely, ma'am.
They employing the wound. That's see for Freud, femininity said that it's hysteric, it's pathological. Femininity itself is pathological because you're supposed to enjoy certain wounds. The open wound. I mean, all cultures they go through open wound. It's bleeding, and time to time, what happens with the open wound is because it's never heals, it will be wrong. So this violence that we saw in Texas day before yesterday, children being killed out of no reason, it's actually symbolizes. Nietzsche said that despite this very glamorous Athenian society, why did people so much go and watch the tragedy of Edinburgh? There must be something very dark in that society. It was filled with slavery, oppression of women. They would enjoy opera tragedies, and we have Sophocles with his Antigone, who kind of brought the whole system down. First of all, her being itself was a transgression. She was a product of incest, and then she wanted to bury her father slash brother in the same place. So there is something. This open wound is very interesting.
Yes, ma'am.
It comes up, and when it comes up, so I'm about to write something which I'll put in the social media that we are looking at the psychopath or whatever, if you don't want to call him psychopath, because everything nowadays is mental illness, whatever the guy took the gun, but what is the deeper wound in American society? What is this deep unhappiness that makes a person take a gun, kill his grandma, go and kill a bunch of children? These are little babies almost. So the open wound is going to come up. See, my forefathers, 3-4 generations ago, they were from what is now Bangladesh, and they migrated. And then in my mother's side, some of them migrated, some of them came as undocumented refugees. And I can still feel that open wound will never heal. It will never heal. So that open wound is going to come up. What is pathology? What is disease? We see the symptom. Someone has a temperature of 100. It's not the symptom, it's the disease. It's a virus or what is it? It's that we have. What is this symptom? What is so deeply pathological about the American society that a guy who is also a child almost, 17, 18 years old, go and kill a bunch of children? What's the pathology? That's the open. And similarly now and other.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all very much.
We had a wonderful discussion, ma'am. We are really benefited, not only the students.
Ma'am,
Yes.
may I ask a question?
Yes, of course. She is one of our research scholars. You can ask.
Yes,
I'm very sorry about this slide, but I couldn't see anything, so I had to put this on. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am, and thank you very much for a very informative session that we had. Ma'am, I have a question regarding a particular work by Shakespeare, that is Hamlet. Ma'am, after reading Freud, as we know that the subsequent psychoanalysts or philosophers, they have more often than not refuted Freud. For example, Deleuze and Guattari, they basically take every opportunity to slash whatever Freud has said. Ma'am, when I was teaching Hamlet to postgraduates, ma'am, I tried to give them a lecture on Ophelia. That is because I thought that when I was studying Hamlet, I was not given enough information and enough theoretical perspectives on Ophelia. So when I was reading up on her or the scholarly articles written on her, I found that Lacan, after refuting Freud, well, he accepts Freud and then refutes his ideas. So he says that that desire is the desire of the other. So, and that desire of the other means that I desire the other as well as I desire what the other desires. So when I'm talking about Ophelia, if I am trying to build a subjectivity based on her becoming as that object of desire, or an object whose desire Hamlet also desires, that is, if I'm trying to arrive at the subjectivity of Ophelia in that manner, like Lacan puts it, am I not trying to arrive at a perverse sort of subjectivity for the woman when I'm permanently locating her in the position of the other?
Exactly, and that's what the search is. And then who is this person? Is it possible for anyone? If you take Lacan, then let us apply a little bit of Tata here. So the man knows, the man doesn't know that he's not fully masculine. His identity is also fragile. But deep down he knows, and because of his insecurity, he imposes the lack on the other. I have it because you have it. For the other, if you take Hegel's master slave dynamics, for the other, she already knows that she lacks, but she has to somehow get by in society. If you take performativity of Rivera, maybe her madness was a performance. Then she'll say, okay, you have it. She knows, no one has it. He doesn't have it. Okay, you have it. I lack it. Let's keep the status quo. I'm mad, you are the rational one. I'm the confused rationality, so I have to be led by you. Maybe, who knows? Ophelia's madness was performativity to keep Hamlet safe. That's one of the ways of reading it. I love it. I mean, Ophelia's whole thing, now it's coming out, right? So many articles.
Yes,
But people never talked about the whole, the whole complex, whole complex thing.
Ma'am, actually, whatever Ophelia says towards the end of the play, that is before her death, the song, that is basically a surrender to the position that has been granted to her by all the male characters, but not without sarcasm and a pinch of salt that she puts in all of her the sentences. That is, so that's very interesting, I think. And she is the better protagonist than Hamlet. The more I was teaching about Ophelia, the more I was hating Hamlet because and so were the students. I really told them that you need not study more about Ophelia because you'll forget studying about Hamlet if you concentrate too much on Ophelia, and the syllabus will not agree to that. That is it. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an engaging session. Thank you for our respected audience and dear students for your questions and comments. So, is there any other question? Anyone from our audience? Okay. So, let us move towards the.
I was just thinking of one comment. May I?
Yes.
Or is it too late?
Definitely, Tanya ma'am. Please.
Tanya Di, please.
To begin with, thanks to Professor Mazumdar, it was absolutely fabulous. I just was, when I was listening to you, I was actually thinking of, Nancy Chodorow, where she is talking about, I mean, not just about sexual differentiation, but also how it is different for, men and women. Because for boys, she says, differentiation from the mother to the other, that is based on differentiation, but I mean, differentiation in the sense because the boy's sex and the mother's sex are different. But specifically, when she is talking about the girl child, she says that it's not that painful because it is built on sameness. So, if you are individuating, if you are building your ego, and at the same time, if it is built on sameness, I mean, does it also entail that, when the girl child is growing up, she still retains that sense of, what the mother keeps on, reiterating. I mean, during its time and even beyond, the maternal instinct, it's become so cliched. These were the women who first challenged it. But again, if Chodorow is saying that no, it is built on sameness, so there will be vestiges of what the mother has taught always in the girl. I mean, how do you look at that?
It's very interesting to bring that up because Chodorow very clearly showed the reproduction of mother. See, I want to make a different comment here. I think who's that? Terry Gilton says that Althusser first said labor power is produced in ideology. And Terry Gilton says that what keeps the British labor class going is beer, and what keeps the French labor class going is wine. Which is very true, and probably in India it's also some kind of modus operandi. So anyway, so it's what's interesting is motherhood is a very ideological thing, because you don't just mother in the material sense, but you also have to reproduce it, because you have to reproduce the entire society in that sense. And that's how Chaudhary give us that vision that it's certainly not instinctual, it's the ideological reproduction. That, like the transgenerational trauma, and people cannot break that trauma. The open wound remains. The open wound is nurtured. The open wound is nurtured, relish, reproduced. Like the labor power is produced in ideology. That's how it is. It's nurtured and it's reproduced. The sameness is reproduced. It's not the difference.
Right.
And she brought it. Yeah, she brought it. What's her genius is she brought it back to sociology and not biology.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Tanya ji. Thank you, ma'am, for such an engaging session. So, I would request Professor Troy Sinha to deliver the vote of thanks for today's session. Over to you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Momita. And I'm just spellbound. First of all, I have no words to say, although I need to follow this kind of formal delivering the vote of thanks. But it's such an opportunity to listen to you, ma'am. So first of all, this is my heartfelt gratitude and my sincerest thanks to you because you have enriched us with your valuable time and your valuable words. I think all the faculty members as well as the students and the research scholars, they are greatly benefited. And so my sincerest thanks to you. Next, I want to I want to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, Professor Dr. Shoma Bandyopadhyay, for always giving her support. And so is our Registrar Sir, Dr. Saidul Rahman. He has always encouraged us for organizing this kind of lectures and webinars. Thanks also goes to Professor Tapan Mondol, Dean, Faculty of Arts. And I think that I always take this opportunity to thank Dr. Tania Chakraborty, our very own Tania Di, Dean of Students Welfare, for always encouraging us. And whenever we call Tania Di, she always tries to join us, whether it's a wall magazine publication or to join such webinars and lectures. So Tania Di, I'm thankful to you. I'm also thankful to my colleagues who have joined. And in relation to this, I would like to thank our finance officer of Diamond Harbour Women's University, our non-teaching staff, the audience for joining us and also to listen to this lecture. I think that looking forward to this kind of lecture in future. So I thank you all and wish you good night. Thank you.
Thank you.